On November 4, 1979, Iranian militant students tragically invaded the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 66 U.S. citizens captive. Adding to this calamity, 8 American soldiers were later killed in a failed rescue mission. Triumphantly, Iran released the captives 444 days later as a result of international economic and political pressure. After failures such as Vietnam, the ongoing Cold War, and the Watergate scandal, Jimmy Carter brought humanitarian improvements to the government and the world.
For too many years, we've been willing to adopt the flawed and erroneous principles and tactics of our adversaries, sometimes abandoning our own values for theirs.
President Carter organized a nuclear arms control agreement with the Soviet Union and facilitated the Camp David Accords, which engendered peace between Egypt, the United States, and Israel. America's dependency on imported oil dictated her relations with Middle Eastern countries. In addition, oil was the first source of tension between the United States and Iran. During the 1940s, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, led Iran into a period of prosperity by exchanging 80% of Iran's oil reserves for millions of dollars in economic and military aid from the United States. Despite his economic and political success, the Shah was a cruel and brutal man who terrorized his people. The CIA helped establish the Savak, his secret police, domestic security, and intelligence service. In 1953, Iran's popular Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, announced a plan to nationalize the country's oil industry. With U.S. oil interests in mind, the CIA directed an operation to remove Mossadegh and give power back to the Shah. After a violent capture, Mossadegh was tried for treason. For the United States, the coup was a success. In Iran, however, the continued uneven distribution of wealth and the westernizing influence of the United States led to a confrontation between Islamic clergy and the Shah, thereby forced to exile a religious nationalist named Ayatollah Khomeini from Iran. In 1979, after months of protests and riots against the Shah, he was forced to leave the country, allowing Khomeini to return. Khomeini declared his intent to purge Iran of Western culture and establish traditional Islamic law. Precursing events to come, on February 14, 1979, Iranian revolutionaries held a U.S. embassy guard in Tehran captive for 1 week. While the issue was quickly resolved, Americans feared future Iranian retaliation.
We should have shut down the embassy after February 14th and said to the Iranians, when you want us back, we'll be back.
Inflicted with cancer, the Shah requested treatment in the United States, who, despite several threats from Iran warning them that the American embassy would be taken if the Shah were allowed into the U.S., graciously admitted the Shah in October of 1979, causing riots in Iran. America's fears became reality on November 4, 1979. At 6:30 a.m., Iranian college students held a demonstration outside the U.S. embassy. The situation escalated, with the protesters climbing over the walls. The militant students detained 66 U.S. Embassy employees, diplomatic personnel, and Marines in the building. To make matters worse, classified information fell into the revolutionaries' hands as shredded papers were repaired.
Young man, looking rather ferocious at that time, started to kick the door down. This person said to me in a loud voice in Farsi, "You are under arrest. You're a member of the nest of spies."
Contrary to the fake news released by the Iranian government, the captors treated the hostages cruelly. Robert Odie, one of the hostages, in his diary of the crisis, wrote that, quote, "The captors had no conversation with us. They looked at us as though we were animals in a zoo," end quote. Shows such as ABC's Nightline had daily updates on the crisis and counted the days of America held hostage. In response to the invasion of the embassy, Carter froze Iranian assets in the U.S. and embargoed Iranian oil and trade. He appealed to the Iranians to release the hostages on humanitarian grounds and urged them to share in an anti-communist alliance. In response, Khomeini announced that the 13 female, African-American, and non-U.S. citizen hostages would be released on November 19th and 20th because women and minorities already suffered from the, quote, oppression of American society, end quote. 52 Americans, including 2 women and 1 African American, remained as hostages. Khomeini and his supporters used the hostage crisis as an embarrassment to the Carter administration. Both diplomatic maneuvers and economic sanctions had little influence on the anti-American stance of the Iranian government. The United Nations, International Court of Justice, and American government all attempted to persuade the militant students and Khomeini to release the hostages, by lowering oil production to pressure Iran's national finances, frustrating the army by cutting off military equipment supply, and mobilizing world opinion against Iran. Despite all this, Khomeini refused to release the hostages. 170 days after the invasion of the embassy, the Secretary of Defense organized Operation Eagle Claw, a military mission with the goal of rescuing the hostages. On the night of April 24th, several of the helicopters involved in the operation malfunctioned due to the sandstorms, and the mission was abandoned. During the evacuation of the landing site, a helicopter and plane crashed, incinerating both aircrafts and killing 8 crewmen. Congress immediately convened and voted to create the U.S. Special Operations Command. This highly successful anti-terrorism organization is the enduring legacy of Eagle Claw. Carter's last diplomatic efforts to bring the 52 hostages home were successful, but not until after Carter's last term as president. As a final blow to Carter, on January 20th, 1981, Iran released the hostages minutes after Reagan was inaugurated. The U.S. government assessed that, quote, "The overwhelming majority of American hostages conducted themselves with strength and resolution. They kept faith with each other and cooperated with the Iranians only to the extent that their physical and mental well-being required," end quote. The hostage taking was about more than the Shah's medical care. It was a dramatic declaration of the end of American interference in Iran's economic and political affairs. As one journalist stated, quote, "The Iranian hostage crisis, as it came to be known, was a watershed moment in U.S. history. All at once, it symbolized the haplessness of the Carter administration, the hostility to the U.S. in what was then called the Third World, and America's image of itself as weak and dysfunctional in the wake of Watergate, Vietnam, and stagflation," end quote. The Iranian hostage crisis defeated one president and helped to elect another. When Reagan ran for election, the Iranian hostage crisis had harmed Carter enough that Reagan won by a landslide, with Carter receiving the lowest public approval rating for any U.S. president. With the U.S.'s influence declining in Middle Eastern countries, the Soviet Union supported communist organizations in Ethiopia, Angola, and Mozambique. In the latter part of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to rebuild its Marxist government. President Carter, in response, embargoed Soviet Union trade in America, resulting in newly increased tensions between the two nations during the Cold War. With Iran producing a large portion of the oil supplied by the Persian Gulf region, now embargoed in the U.S., oil prices soared to new heights, and dangers of a first world economic collapse were realized. The heads of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, met in Vienna at the same time as Iraq began to launch airstrikes against Iran. The Iran v. Iraq War, partially spurred by the Iranian hostage crisis, further raised oil prices until OPEC resolved the threatening situation by universally lowering the price of oil. Obsessive media coverage of the hostage crisis, which caused Iran and Islam in general to seem irrational and hostile, greatly tainted America's opinion of the Middle East. The crisis was rarely put into historical context by mentioning the U.S. government's coup in 1953 or the United States' support for Iran's oppressive dictator, the Shah. The pattern of media ignorance followed by frenzy repeated itself in the days following September 11, 2001, when images of the Middle East flooded the news. The result was a woefully uneducated public about a region now stereotyped as radical and terroristic. Even now, about 40 years later, these negative impressions influence American attempts to engage with the Middle East. Anthony Dworkin, from U.S. Foreign Policy, states that, quote, "We continue to hear very hostile rhetoric harking back to the period of the hostage crisis from Iran's leaders," end quote. After 444 days of 52 American embassy workers being held captive in Iran, every hostage was triumphantly able to return home to their families, but not without a cost. Today, U.S. citizens have in part to thank the Iranian hostage crisis for the rising prices of oil, as well as the U.S. Special Ops Forces. Tragically for President Carter, this crisis drew his attention away from the next election, leaving the door wide open for Reagan. Future relations between Iran and the U.S. were tragically shattered, and the lives of several soldiers were lost in an effort to retrieve the hostages. Furthermore, without the stable and active democratic presence of the United States in the Middle East, communism's tragic oppressiveness reigned over less fortunate countries. Iran captured the world's attention, and America encountered radical Islam on a major scale for the first time.
We can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans. God bless you and thank you.